They laughed when he claimed to be Billionaire's son until he inherited $90 million. Your father left you $90 million. That's the first thing the stranger said right there. In the middle of a tiny cafe on a rainy morning in Xiamen, the cup in Leo's hand slipped and shattered against the floor. For 20 years, he had no father, no answers, just his mother's silence and the hum of the sea outside their window. And now, out of nowhere, the world told him he was the son of a man who built empires and never looked back. Outside, the rain hit the glass like whispers of a truth too heavy to bear. One side of the world held skyscrapers and gold. The other, a boy who never even owned a passport. What would you have done in his place? Would you take the fortune or reject the man who never claimed you? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you the story of the son who never asked to be rich. Liu Zhang never expected his life to change that morning. He stood behind the counter of the cafe, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in soapy water, counting the minutes until closing time. His mother had been sick again, and the extra shifts helped pay for her medicine. The bell above the door jingled softly, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He didn't look like the usual customers. His eyes searched the room until they found Leo. The man introduced himself as Victor Liang, a lawyer from San Francisco. He spoke calmly, almost too calmly, as if afraid that his words might tear through the quiet. He said Leo's name, then the name Richard Hartman, and for a moment, the two names sounded like they belonged to different worlds. Leo's heart froze. He wiped his hands, trying to understand why this stranger knew his father's name when even he had never dared to say it aloud. The lawyer placed an envelope on the counter. Inside was a letter from a law firm confirming that Liu Zhang was the legal heir of Richard Hartman, founder of Global Express. Leo didn't speak. His body went cold, as if the air had been pulled out of the room. He felt anger before he felt disbelief. His father, the man who had never written, never called, never sent a single coin. Now he was gone, leaving behind millions Leo never asked for. Victor kept talking about documents, DNA results, and inheritance laws. But the words dissolved into noise. All Leo could think about was the last time his mother mentioned that name. He remembered her sitting on the bamboo chair by the window, the one that creaked when she rocked slowly at night. In her hands was a faded photograph of a tall man in a white shirt standing by the ocean. She said he was kind, but kindness wasn't love. She told Leo not to hate him, but not to wait for him either. Back then, Leo didn't understand what she meant. Now he did. Kindness is easy when it costs nothing. Love, real love, is when you stay. He stared at the envelope again. His reflection shimmered faintly on the cafe's window, caught between the light and the rain. He wanted to tear the papers apart, to shout that he didn't need anything from a man who had given him nothing. But deep down, curiosity twisted inside him. Who was this father? Everyone seemed to know but him. Why had he been forgotten so easily? Victor left a card on the counter and said he would wait for Leo's answer. When the door closed, Leo stood still for a long time, his hands trembling. The cafe was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. That night, he went home and told his mother, but she only smiled weakly. She said fate has strange ways of bringing truth to the surface, even when you're not ready. A week later, Leo stood outside his small apartment with a suitcase at his feet and a ticket in his hand. San Francisco, the place his father built his empire. His stomach tightened as he looked at the plane ticket. It felt less like a gift and more like a curse, written in fine print. He didn't know what he would find on the other side of the world. But he knew he had to go. For his mother, for the questions that never stopped haunting him, for himself. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I'll find out who he really was, even if it breaks me." The flight to San Francisco felt like crossing into another world. The air was cold, dry, and smelled faintly of metal and rain. Leo sat by the airplane window, watching the clouds drift below like continents of silence. He had never left China before. Every sound on the plane, the click of a seatbelt, the whisper of English around him, reminded him how far from home he already was. When they landed, he felt his stomach tighten. Somewhere in this city, buried among glass towers and noise, was the truth about his life. Victor Liang met him at the airport. He spoke kindly, explaining that the DNA test would settle everything. Leo nodded, though he barely understood what everything meant anymore. They drove through streets filled with people who didn't look twice at him. To them, he was invisible, a stranger with a foreign face and a borrowed name. By the time they reached the testing facility, Leo's palms were damp and his throat felt dry. He tried to steady his breathing, repeating his mother's words in his head, "Stand tall, even when no one sees you." The lab smelled of antiseptic and paper, white walls, bright lights, rows of chairs filled with people pretending to be calm. Leo counted 12 others, men and women, some young, some older, dressed in designer suits and expensive shoes. They carried folders, lawyers, and confidence. Leo carried only a worn wallet and a trembling heart. He sat at the edge of the waiting area, trying not to make eye contact. But eyes found him anyway, whispering, measuring, judging. One woman, tall and perfectly groomed, sat 2 rows away. Amelia Hartman. Her perfume reached him before her words did. She leaned toward another woman and said, just loud enough for him to hear, that they must have started importing heirs now. A soft laugh followed. It was sharp, practiced, and cruel. Leo froze. His fingers dug into his knees under the table. For a second, he imagined standing up, shouting that blood didn't need a passport. But his voice got stuck somewhere behind his ribs. He could still hear his mother saying that dignity was not given, it was held. So he stayed quiet, letting their laughter fade into the sterile hum of the room. When his name was called, he stood too fast and almost dropped his ID card. The technician barely looked at him. A quick prick, a vial of blood, a signature. That was it. But the needle didn't hurt half as much as the silence that followed. Outside, reporters waited behind glass doors. Their cameras flashed like lightning, each one shouting a version of his name he didn't recognize. The sound of clicking shutters was deafening. He lowered his head and kept walking. One reporter yelled something in English he couldn't understand, except for one word that came out clear: bastard. The word hit him harder than the flash. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His hands shook, but he kept them by his sides. Victor reached out to guide him away, but Leo pulled slightly back. He wanted to walk on his own. That night, in his hotel room, Leo sat by the window, staring at the glittering skyline. The city looked beautiful from a distance, clean, endless, full of light, but up close. It felt cold, like a mirror that reflected everyone but him. He poured a glass of water and realized his hand was still shaking. He set it down carefully, afraid it might slip like his father's name had slipped from every story he'd ever been told. He thought about Amelia's laugh, the way her eyes had scanned him like a stain on silk. He tried to hate her, but all he felt was exhaustion. People feared what they didn't understand. He had spent his whole life being misunderstood. Maybe this was just a bigger version of that same pain. He whispered to himself that pain, too, could be survived if you stayed still long enough to let it pass. Days crawled by until the results arrived. Victor brought the envelope to his hotel room, his expression unreadable. Leo held it between his fingers, feeling the weight of something that wasn't paper but destiny. He hesitated. For a second, he wished he could stay in that moment of not knowing forever. But truth never waited. It demanded to be opened. The result was clear, positive. Leo Zhang was the biological son of Richard Hartman. He read the line twice, 3 times, waiting for the words to feel real. They didn't. Instead of relief, a strange heaviness spread through him. The truth was supposed to set him free, but it felt more like a chain tightening around his chest. He looked at Victor, who smiled gently and said it was over. But Leo knew better. It was just beginning. Within hours, the world knew his name. News headlines flashed across screens, twisting his story into something cheap. Chinese boy steals billionaire's fortune. The phrase spread like wildfire. On social media, strangers debated his worth, his mother's virtue, his right to exist. They called him names, dissected his face, his accent, his silence. Some called him brave, but most called him fake. Leo stopped reading after the first day. The words sank too deep. They hurt in places no one could see. He turned off his phone, but the noise stayed in his head. He looked out at the city again, its lights still pretending to be stars, and whispered that maybe truth wasn't always a gift. Sometimes it was just another kind of loneliness. That night, he lay awake, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. Each breath felt heavier than the last. He thought of his mother, her cracked hands, her steady eyes, her soft voice telling him that no one could humiliate you unless you let them. He held on to that thought like a rope in the dark. He didn't know what waited for him next, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't break. Not for them, not for the world. Leo couldn't sleep that night. The news headlines still echoed in his head, mixing with the laughter of those who had mocked him. Somewhere deep inside, he kept hearing his mother's voice, soft and calm, reminding him that truth doesn't always protect you, but it always finds you. As he lay awake, staring at the hotel ceiling, he realized there was so much about her life he never truly understood. To understand himself, he would have to return to where it all began, to the story of Evelyn Zhang, and the man who left her behind. In 1994, Evelyn was 19, quiet and invisible. She worked as a maid in a seaside hotel in Xiamen, where the smell of salt water never left her skin. Every day she polished the same floors, changed the same sheets, and served guests whose lives were worlds apart from hers. She dreamed of leaving one day, but didn't even have enough money for a bus ticket home. When the foreign investor arrived, she barely noticed him at first. He wore plain clothes, at his simple meals, and spoke with a patience she had never seen in rich men before. His name was Richard Hartman. He had come to Sharman to inspect the site for a new golf resort. Everyone at the hotel whispered about him, the American, with endless money and a face that carried sadness. But to Evelyn, he was just another guest. Until the afternoon, he returned from the beach with his shoes soaked in rain and asked her, in broken Mandarin, if there was somewhere quiet to wait out the storm. She led him to the maintenance hut behind the hotel, a small wooden shelter by the shore. The sound of rain hitting the roof filled the silence between them. He spoke about how the sea reminded him of home, how peace was hard to find even in luxury. She didn't understand every word, but she saw something familiar in his eyes, loneliness. For the first time, someone looked at her as a person, not a servant. He asked her name, and when she said Evelyn Jung, he smiled and told her it sounded like music. She laughed softly, embarrassed, but his gentleness disarmed her. They met again the next evening. Then again after that. It wasn't a grand love story, just two people who found comfort in each other's silence. He told her he would return soon, that he wanted to see her again once the project was finished. She didn't ask for promises. She just wished, silently, that the rain would last longer. When he left Sharman, she waited by the docks every evening for weeks. Each day, her heart shrank a little more. Then the morning sickness began. She hid it for as long as she could, afraid of what people would say. When the hotel manager found out, she was fired without pay. The man who had once smiled at her now refused to look her in the eye. She left the city, carrying nothing but a small bag and the child growing inside her. Her parents were poor fishermen in a nearby village. When she returned home, they were ashamed. Neighbors whispered that she had sold herself to a foreigner for money. No one believed her when she said it wasn't like that. In their eyes, she had ruined her family's honor. But Evelyn didn't cry. She sewed clothes for people in town, washed laundry, did whatever she could to survive. When the baby came, she named him Leo, a name that sounded both Chinese and foreign, a name that belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. She loved him fiercely from the moment she saw him. Even when her own father refused to hold the baby, she held him tighter. When food was scarce, she fed him first. When sickness came, she stayed up all night, cooling his fever with a damp towel. Once, a neighbor sneered that Leo was a mistake. Evelyn looked up from washing clothes and said that maybe he was a mistake. But he was hers, and she would love her mistake until her last breath. Years passed in quiet struggle. She never spoke badly about Richard, even when people insulted him. She kept one photograph, the one where he stood by the sea, smiling faintly, hidden in a wooden box under her bed. Sometimes she took it out at night, not to remember him, but to remind herself that what they had, however brief, had been real. She told Leo his father was kind but weak, that sometimes good men still make bad choices. When Leo started school, other children mocked him for looking different. His hair was lighter, his eyes a little deeper. Evelyn walked him home each day, pretending not to hear the whispers. At night, when he asked why he didn't look like the other boys, she told him the truth, that he was born from love, not shame. Her voice never shook. Even though her heart did, she aged faster than her years. But she never complained. She saved every coin, hoping one day Leo could study abroad. When he turned 16, she told him there was something he needed to see. She opened the old box and showed him the photograph. She said the man in it was his father. She didn't tell him about the pain, the betrayal, or the nights she had cried alone. She simply said, "He was kind, but kindness is not love." Now, years later, Leo finally understood those words. She hadn't meant them as bitterness. She meant them as truth. His mother had loved deeply, caredly, and without expectation. That was the kind of love that didn't need to be returned to matter. As he thought of her, tears stung his eyes. He realized that every sacrifice she had made was not out of weakness, but strength. She had chosen dignity when the world gave her none. In that hotel room in San Francisco, Leo took out the old photograph he still carried in his wallet. The paper had faded, but his mother's handwriting on the back was still clear. It read, "For Leo, so you'll know he was real. But you were always enough." For the first time since arriving in America, Leo let himself cry. He wasn't crying for his father anymore. He was crying for the woman who had carried his name through the storm, who had taught him that love, even when abandoned, still had the power to endure. The court smelled of paper, dust, and fear. 2 years had passed since Leo first set foot in America. Yet he still felt like a visitor in someone else's story. Cameras crowded the hallway outside, flashing like storms through glass. Inside, the air was tight. Every whisper echoed. Every breath felt borrowed. He sat beside Victor at the long wooden table, hands folded, eyes steady. Across from him sat Eleanor Hartman, the legal wife, her jewelry glinting under the courtroom lights. She didn't look at Leo, not once. To her, he was invisible. A rumor turned into flesh. Around her were lawyers in dark suits, faces carved in arrogance. Leo could almost smell their certainty. The judge read names and motions, but Leo barely heard. He was staring at his hands. They trembled slightly, though he tried to keep them still. Every sound, a pen tapping, a cough. The shuffle of paper felt louder than it should. He remembered his mother's words. "Don't let them take your dignity. No matter what they call you." He kept breathing, counting each one like a small act of defiance. When the witnesses began to speak, their voices blurred together. Some claimed to have known Richard for decades. Some swore Leo's mother had been nothing but a maid, with ambition. One man even said she had trapped Richard out of greed. The words sliced through Leo like cold wind. He wanted to stand, to defend her honor. But Victor's hand on his arm told him to wait. He could fight with silence too. During a break, Victor leaned close and whispered that things were turning against them. The press loved a villain, and they had decided Evelyn was one. Leo looked out the small window beside their table. Rain streaked down the glass like veins. He whispered that the truth was still the truth, even when no one believed it. Victor sighed. He didn't answer. When the court reconvened, tension thickened like fog. Eleanor rose to speak. Her voice was smooth, practiced, but underneath it was venom. She said she pitied Richard for his weakness. She said his generosity had been mistaken for love. And then, as her anger sharpened, she pointed at Leo. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. "He is nothing but a mistake." For a heartbeat, time froze. Leo felt the air leave his lungs. His chest tightened. His ears rang. And for a second, the room disappeared. He was no longer in a courtroom. He was back in the tiny house in Charmin. His mother was sitting by the window, mending his school shirt, humming softly. Her hands were thin, her eyes tired. But she smiled, when he asked why people called them names. Because they don't understand love. She had said, "But you will." He blinked, and the courtroom returned. The weight of every gaze pressed against him. Reporters leaned forward. Lawyers whispered. Even the judge paused. Pen frozen midair. Leo's heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his throat. His hands shook beneath the table. For a moment, he thought about staying silent, like always. But then he remembered his mother's breath. Her voice. Her pride. He stood slowly. The chair scraped against the floor. The sound felt like thunder in a quiet church. He didn't plan his words. They came from somewhere deeper, older, where truth lived raw and unpolished. His voice was calm, almost too soft. But it carried, "Maybe I am a mistake, but my mother never lied, and she raised me to tell the truth." Even when no one wanted to hear it, no one moved. The air itself seemed to stop breathing. His voice trembled slightly on the last word. But he didn't hide it. He let it live. Fragile and human. Then he sat down. His pulse still raced. But his heart felt strangely steady. Like something heavy had finally been set down. Reporters began typing again. Fingers clattering like rain on glass. Eleanor's face flushed red. Victor looked at him, speechless. For the first time in the entire trial, Leo saw a flicker of something in Eleanor's eyes. Not guilt, not pity, but recognition. The kind you feel when the truth stings too close. When court adjourned that day, the world outside exploded. Headlines spread before Leo even reached the door. The bastard who spoke with dignity. Some mocked him. Some called him brave. But everyone listened. The sentence replayed on every network. Cut and quoted. Turned into something bigger than he'd meant. He didn't want fame. He wanted silence. Weeks passed before the final verdict. When the judge finally read the decision, Leo barely reacted. His name was confirmed as Richard Hartman's son. The inheritance would be divided among the heirs, including him. Victor smiled, whispered, "Congratulations." But Leo didn't smile back. Victory didn't taste like justice. It tasted like ash. As the gavel struck, a cold realization settled in him. Money could prove blood, but not love. The court had given him a father on paper, but it could never give him what he lost. Outside, cameras blinded him again. Reporters shouted questions, hungry for quotes. One asked how it felt to win. Leo stopped, turned toward them, and said quietly that you can't win a war that costs your mother's name. Then he walked away before they could speak again. In the car, Victor told him he had made history. Leo looked out the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky still felt heavy. He said history forgets faster than it forgives. Then he closed his eyes and thought of his mother, her frail hands, her gentle strength. He wished she had been there to see that moment, not for the victory, but for the silence that followed. That night, in his hotel room, Leo sat on the floor beside his bed. The courtroom echoed in his mind, every word replaying like a broken record. Mistake, mother, truth. He pressed his palms against his chest and tried to steady his breathing. The sound of his heartbeat was the only thing real. Slowly, quietly, he whispered her name. Evelyn, the one person who had given him everything without asking for anything in return. He realized then that he hadn't fought for money. He had fought for her, for the woman who taught him to stand tall, even when the world tried to bend him. And though the verdict gave him his father's name, it was his mother's voice that gave him peace. When dawn came, Leo opened the curtains and let the light in. The city glowed gold under the morning sun. He took a deep breath and whispered, not to the world, but to himself, that he was done proving who he was. He already knew. When the noise of the courtroom faded and the headlines began to die down, Leo was left with silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. 2 years of fighting had ended, but there was no celebration waiting for him. Victory had come too late. His mother was already gone. She had passed away weeks before the final verdict, her lungs too weak to take another breath. Victor was the one who told him, his voice shaking, when he said she had whispered his name before she closed her eyes. Her last words were simple, don't let money bury your heart. Leo didn't cry when he heard it, nor at first. He sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the night sky through the window. For the first time, he felt what wealth truly cost. It wasn't the money that weighed him down. It was the emptiness that came with it. He had won the world and lost the only person who made it mean something. For days, he walked around like a ghost, avoiding the press, ignoring the congratulations. Every message that said he was lucky felt like a wound. A month later, he returned to Xiamen. He carried his mother's ashes in a small white urn. When he reached the beach where she once met his father, the wind was soft and the tide gentle, as if the sea itself remembered her. He stepped into the water, let the waves touch his ankles, and opened the urn. The ashes scattered into the wind, swirling above the same ocean that had once carried Richard Hartman's plane. Leo whispered her name and told her he was sorry it took him so long to understand. He had spent years chasing a name, only to realize that everything that mattered had been with him all along. When the urn was empty, he stood there until the tide came in. He didn't want to leave. The sea had always been part of her story, and now it was his too. That night, he stayed in the same old village house. The walls cracked but familiar. He looked through the window and imagined her voice again, calm and full of love. He understood now that she had never wanted him to hate his father. She just wanted him to become someone better, someone who could turn pain into kindness. After returning to America, Leo refused the mansion that came with his inheritance. He sold the luxury cars, the stocks, and the properties. He kept what he needed to live, simply, and used the rest to start something new. The One Sky Foundation began with a single idea that no child should feel unwanted for being different. He traveled to small towns in the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, finding children who shared stories like his own. Some had been abandoned because of their mixed blood, some because of poverty. He told them his story, not to make them sad, but to show them they were not alone. People were surprised that a millionaire lived in a small apartment, cooked his own food, and wore the same jacket every day. But Leo didn't need luxury. He had seen what greed could destroy. What he wanted now was peace. At night, he would sit by the window of his modest home in Rhode Island. Reading the letters from children, the foundation helped. Each one was a reminder that his mother's love had not died with her. It lived on in every small act of compassion he gave back to the world. One evening, Victor visited him and asked if he ever regretted it all, giving up so much of what he had fought for. Leo smiled faintly and said that maybe money could buy a house, but not a home. It could buy silence, but not peace. He said his mother had given him both, and no fortune could equal that. Victor didn't argue. He just nodded. understanding that Leo had finally found what he had been searching for since the day that stranger walked into the cafe. Years later, when people asked about his father, Leo no longer hesitated. He would say that his father gave him life, but his mother taught him how to live it. He didn't carry bitterness anymore, only gratitude. Gratitude that the truth, as cruel as it was, had led him to purpose. He kept one framed photograph in his living room, his mother's smile, soft and unbreakable. Beneath it, a handwritten note from her old letters. Love is the only wealth that never fades. Years passed quietly after Leo founded One Sky Foundation. His life became steady, simple, and full of purpose. Yet sometimes, when night fell and the ocean breeze carried through his small apartment window, he still wondered what his father might have said if he'd had the chance. Not to justify himself, but to speak honestly, one last time. That question remained buried somewhere deep in his heart until the day Victor called. Victor's voice on the phone carried a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. He said that while reviewing old estate files in Hawaii, he had found something hidden inside a locked safe from Richard Hartman's villa. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with time, addressed simply for my son. When Leo flew to Hawaii a few days later, he didn't know if he was ready. He had made peace with his past. Or so he thought. But standing by the ocean where the safe had been stored, he realized that peace doesn't mean the absence of questions. It means learning to live with the ones that remain. Victor handed him the letter with quiet respect and left him alone by the shore. The paper trembled in Leo's hands as he unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but unmistakably human. The words began with an apology. Richard wrote that he had known about Evelyn and the child, that he had received the photographs but lacked the courage to face what they meant. He said he was afraid not of the truth, but of what it demanded from him. He had spent a lifetime building walls of power and wealth, only to discover they could not keep out loneliness. As Leo read, his breath caught. The letter spoke of guilt, of the way Richard had tried to forget, but never could. He wrote that he had left gifts and plans behind, but none of it mattered because he had failed at the simplest thing a man could do, stay silly. He admitted that he had loved Evelyn's quiet strength, her way of seeing through his success and finding the lost boy beneath. He said he had dreamed of returning, but fear had a way of turning promises into ghosts. The final line was short. I was afraid to love you, not because of who you are, but because I knew loving you would expose the man I wasn't. Leo's vision blurred. The wind from the ocean lifted the edges of the paper, as if the sea itself wanted to read it too. For a long time, he couldn't move. The letter wasn't an excuse, but a confession. It didn't erase the years of silence. Yet somehow, it softened them. He felt something shift inside him, not anger, not pity, but understanding. His father had been broken too, just in a different way. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. For the first time, the name Richard Hartman didn't feel like a shadow. It felt human. Leo whispered softly that he forgave him, not because the man deserved it, but because his mother would have wanted him to. She had taught him that forgiveness was not surrender, but freedom. That love was never wasted, even when it went unanswered. The sun was setting when he walked to the edge of the shore. The sky burned with gold, and the waves moved with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. He read the letter one last time, then placed it in a small glass bottle and released it into the sea. Watching it drift away, he felt a strange calm spread through him. maybe somewhere beyond what eyes could see. It would find its way home. That night, Leo sat on the sand until the stars appeared. He thought about how his father had feared love and how his mother had lived it. Between those two truths, he had finally found his balance. The world would remember him as the heir who spoke with dignity. But Leo knew who he truly was, the son of a woman who never lied, and a man who finally did. When he left the beach, he didn't look back. The ocean whispered behind him like a lullaby, carrying both the past and forgiveness into the deep. For the first time in his life, Leo felt whole. The storm was over. Leo Zhang's story began with a letter that broke him, but it ended with one that healed him. He had once been the forgotten son of a man the world called powerful, yet his true strength came not from the millions he inherited, but from the forgiveness he chose to give. Today, he lives quietly in Rhode Island, teaching English to immigrant children who remind him of his younger self. Every evening, he video calls volunteers from Asia, guiding projects that help single mothers and abandoned mixed-race children find a future that once seemed impossible. His home is small, but it is filled with laughter. There are no golden frames or luxury suits, only letters from children and photographs of lives changed. Sometimes he stands by the window, watching the sea beyond the harbor, and whispers that his mother would have loved this peace. People still ask if he ever feels bitterness toward his father, and he always smiles. He says that hate only continues what pain began, but forgiveness ends it. Leo has learned that life's true inheritance isn't money, legacy, or even a name. It is the love we choose to carry and the compassion we leave behind. He once said in an interview that wealth can build walls, but love builds bridges. The world remembered one line from that day. The richest man isn't the one who owns the most, but the one who forgives the deepest. And maybe that is where his story lives now, in the hearts of those who still believe that kindness matters, that forgiveness heals, and that even the forgotten can become the light that guides others home. If this story touched your heart, share it. Somewhere out there, another Leo is still waiting to be seen, still waiting to be loved. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes, where every story reminds us that no life is too small to echo through another soul. Thank you for listening.